Welcome back. Tonight, we're drifting into something a little different from our usual deep lore explorations. Instead of tracing timelines or unraveling mysteries buried in mini-games, we're going to examine how Five Nights at Freddy's has evolved the very nature of fear itself, across more than a decade of games. From the claustrophobic office of the original game to the sprawling neon corridors of the Mega Pizzaplex, Scott Cawthon and the teams at Steel Wool Studios have continuously refined, reimagined, and revolutionized how horror manifests in this franchise. This isn't just about jump scares or animatronics lurking in the dark. This is about understanding how each game in the series has contributed something unique to the architecture of dread that defines Five Nights at Freddy's. As we settle in for this journey through fear's evolution, you'll notice we're examining not just what scares us in these games, but why it works, how the mechanics themselves become instruments of terror, and how each installment has built upon or deliberately subverted what came before. Whether you're here to revisit familiar frights, understand the psychological craftsmanship behind your favorite entries, or simply let the analysis wash over you as you drift towards sleep, this exploration will touch every major evolution in how FNAF approaches horror. Before we begin our descent into the mechanics of terror, feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoy this kind of thoughtful, immersive exploration of gaming horror. And let me know in the comments which FNAF game truly gets under your skin the most, and why. And the answers might surprise you, as we'll discover that different games tap into fundamentally different fears. Some of you might find the original's simplicity the most effective, while others might cite the personal vulnerability of the fourth game, or the overwhelming scale of security breach. There's no wrong answer, because FNAF's genius lies in how it approaches fear from so many different angles. Let's begin by returning to where it all started, to that small indie game released in August of 2014 that would change horror gaming forever, and examine exactly what made its approach to fear so devastatingly effective. The foundation, FNAF 1's simple terror. To understand how fear has evolved throughout the FNAF franchise, we need to appreciate the brilliance of the original game's minimalist approach. Our Five Nights at Freddy's wasn't the first horror game to use resource management or surveillance cameras, and it certainly wasn't the first to feature animatronic characters as threats. But what Scott Cawthon achieved with that first game was something remarkable in its elegant simplicity. He created a horror experience that weaponized anticipation itself, turning waiting and watching into acts of psychological endurance that wore down even the most hardened players. The genius of the first game begins with its fundamental premise and the way it restricts player agency to create vulnerability. You are Mike Schmidt, a night security guard stationed in a cramped office at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, and your job is deceptively simple. Survive from midnight until 6 in the morning for 5 consecutive nights. You cannot leave your office, or you cannot fight back. You cannot run. Your only tools are a tablet showing security camera feeds, 2 doors with lights, and a limited power supply that drains with every second you use these defensive measures. This creates what game designers call a negative space, a zone where the horror exists not in what you can do, but in what you cannot do. The security office itself becomes a character in this experience, a space that should feel safe but never quite does. It's lit by the glow of your monitor and the occasional flash of your door lights, casting everything in stark shadows that seem to deepen as the night progresses. The walls feel close, almost suffocatingly so, and the 2 doorways on either side of you become points of acute vulnerability. You can close these doors to keep the animatronics out, but every second they remain closed, you're burning through power you cannot afford to waste. This creates an impossible calculus where safety itself becomes a luxury you cannot sustain. The power mechanic is perhaps the most elegant horror device in the entire game. Represented by a simple percentage indicator in the corner of your screen, it functions as a constantly depleting lifeline that forces you to make agonizing decisions every single second. Do you check the cameras to track the animatronics' movements, knowing that raising the tablet drains power? Do you close the doors preemptively when you hear strange sounds, even though keeping them closed accelerates your power consumption catastrophically? Or do you sit in vulnerable darkness, doors open, desperately hoping that the shuffling sounds you're hearing are just ambient audio and not Bonnie or Chica standing just outside your field of vision? This resource management creates a beautiful horror economy where every action has weight and consequence. There's a mathematically optimal strategy for beating each night, conserving just enough power to make it to 6 a.m., while still defending yourself when necessary. But knowing this strategy intellectually and executing it under pressure are entirely different things. The game deliberately gives you incomplete information, forcing you to piece together the animatronics patterns through trial, error, and the occasional fatal mistake. When you die, it's rarely because the game was unfair. It's because you misjudged, because you panicked, because you left a door open 3 seconds too long, or burned power checking a camera you didn't need to check. The animatronics themselves are masterfully designed to maximize this psychological pressure. Freddy Fazbear, Bonnie the Bunny, Chica the Chicken, and Foxy the Pirate Fox each have distinct behaviors and movement patterns that you must learn through observation and terrible experience. Bonnie tends to approach from the left, Chica from the right, while Foxy lurks in Pirate Cove and will sprint down the hallway if you don't check his camera enough. Freddy, the titular character, is the most complex, gradually advancing through a specific path while his laugh echoes through the building, signaling his approach with cruel clarity. What makes these characters genuinely frightening isn't just their appearance, although their design certainly contributes. It's the uncanny valley effect they create. These entertainment robots meant to delight children during the day, but whose empty eyes and fixed smiles take on a sinister quality in the darkness. They move with mechanical precision, appearing in different camera feeds without transition, reinforcing the disorienting sense that they're not bound by normal physical rules. When you spot Bonnie standing motionless in the supply closet, staring directly at the camera with those pinprick white eyes, your brain registers something fundamentally wrong with this creature that should be entertaining but has become predatory. The sound design elevates every moment of tension into genuine terror. The game's audio is deliberately sparse, with long stretches of near silence broken only by the hum of electronics and your own breathing. This makes every sound significant. The distant sound of footsteps on tile, the metallic groan of movement, the children's laughter that echoes from nowhere. These ambient sounds keep you in a constant state of hypervigilance, never quite sure if what you're hearing is a real threat or just part of the restaurant's disturbing atmosphere. Then, there are the specific audio cues that signal immediate danger. The kitchen camera has no video feed, only audio, forcing you to rely on the banging and clattering sounds to know whether Chica is there. When you hear running footsteps in the hallway, you know Foxy has left his cove, and you have mere seconds to close the left door or face the consequences. These sounds trigger an almost primal response, a spike of adrenaline that makes your hands shake even as you're trying to hit the right buttons to defend yourself. The jump scares themselves, when they come, are brief but devastatingly effective. If an animatronic reaches you, the screen explodes with their face filling your vision, accompanied by a piercing scream that mingles mechanical distortion with something almost organic. These scares work not because they're particularly elaborate, but because they're the punctuation mark on minutes of mounting tension. You've been dreading this moment, watching power drain, listening to footsteps get closer, and when it finally happens, it's both a relief and a shock. The game over screen that follows, showing your character's eyes staring lifelessly from inside a Freddy Fazbear suit, adds a grim narrative consequence to your failure. But the true horror of Five Nights at Freddy's doesn't lie in these jump scares. It lies in the anticipation, the constant awareness that they could happen at any moment if you make the wrong choice. PC Gamer captured this perfectly in their review, noting that the game distinguished itself from the rest of the horror genre by relying not on the jump scares themselves, but by pressuring the player with the possibility of one. This anticipatory dread is far more effective than any number of scripted scares could be, because it transforms the entire experience into a slow-building anxiety that never truly releases until the clock strikes 6 a.m. The phone calls from the previous security guard add another layer to this psychological framework. Voiced by Scott Cawthon himself, these calls provide crucial information about the animatronics and their behaviors, but they're delivered with a casualness that's deeply unsettling. The phone guide talks about children being stuffed into animatronic suits and the robot's tendency to see humans as endoskeletons without costumes, with the same mild concern one might express about a broken coffee machine. This tonal dissonance between the horrific information being conveyed and the matter-of-fact delivery creates cognitive dissonance that heightens the overall sense of unease. The lore hidden in these phone calls and in the environmental details transforms what could have been a simple survival game into something with disturbing implications. There are mentions of the Bite of 87, of missing children, of previous security guards who didn't fare well, and these fragments of backstory suggest that your predicament isn't random or isolated, but part of a larger pattern of violence and tragedy. The building itself feels haunted, not just by malfunctioning robots, but by something darker, a history of suffering that has soaked into the walls and machinery. Critically, the first game's approach to horror was widely praised for its effectiveness, despite, or perhaps because of, its simplicity. Touch Arcade noted that the game challenged players by forcing them to yield to their own paranoia, causing them to lose if they gave in to their fear. This is a crucial insight. Five Nights at Freddy's makes your own fear responses part of the challenge. When you panic and close both doors simultaneously, watching your power drain catastrophically, you're not being defeated by the game's difficulty, but by your own inability to manage terror rationally. The gameplay loop is elegantly simple, yet creates enormous depth through its psychological pressure. You're constantly cycling through the same actions, checking cameras, watching power, listening for audio cues, closing doors when necessary, praying you have enough electricity to reach 6 a.m. There's a rhythm to it that experienced players can learn, a flow state where you're managing resources efficiently while staying alert to threats. But this rhythm is constantly disrupted by the animatronic's semi-random behavior, by the sounds that might or might not indicate danger, by the power percentage dropping lower and lower as the night crawls toward its conclusion. What's remarkable is how replayable this formula proved to be despite its repetitive nature. Each night increases the animatronic's aggression levels, represented by hidden AI difficulty values that make them move more frequently and unpredictably. By night 5, you're dealing with threats that require near-perfect play to survive. The game becomes less about learning a strategy and more about execution under extreme pressure, about maintaining composure when every instinct is screaming at you to panic. The visual design supports this horror through careful use of pre-rendered graphics. Because Scott Cawthon used pre-rendered images rather than real-time 3D graphics, he could create highly detailed atmospheric scenes without worrying about performance optimization. This technical limitation became an artistic strength, allowing for camera feeds that feel genuinely like security footage, grainy and dark, where shadows can hide animatronics or make you see movement where none exists. The static that occasionally crosses the screen adds to this verisimilitude, while also serving a gameplay function, obscuring your vision at crucial moments. The office design itself is worth noting for its contribution to the overall dread. The industrial fan that spins constantly in the corner, the children's drawings scattered across the walls, the desk littered with papers and soda cups, suggesting someone actually works here during normal hours. These details ground the environment in a kind of mundane reality that makes the supernatural threat feel more immediate. This isn't some obviously spooky haunted house. It's a workplace, somewhere that should be boring and safe, and that's exactly what makes its transformation into a death trap so effective. The original Five Nights at Freddy's succeeded not through innovation in mechanics, but through the perfect execution of relatively simple concepts, combined in a way that created something greater than the sum of its parts. The resource management created constant pressure. The limited information forced difficult decisions. The audio design kept you perpetually on edge. The animatronics' semi-predictable behavior gave you just enough hope that you could survive if you were smart and careful. And the jump scares provided the fear of consequences that made every decision matter. This foundation would prove crucial for everything that followed. Future games in the series would add complexity, change settings, introduce new mechanics, and experiment with different approaches to horror. But they would all be building on the principles established here: the power of anticipation over surprise, the effectiveness of restricting player agency, the importance of audio design, and the value of making the player's own fear responses part of the challenge. Five Nights at Freddy's showed that you didn't need a big budget or cutting-edge graphics to create genuinely terrifying experiences. You just needed to understand what makes humans afraid and how to sustain that fear over time. Building complexity. FNAF 2's layered dread. If the original Five Nights at Freddy's proved that minimalist horror could be devastatingly effective, its sequel demonstrated how to expand that formula without losing what made it work. Released just 3 months after the first game in November 2014, our Five Nights at Freddy's 2 took what was already working and layered on additional mechanics, more animatronics, and increased complexity that transformed survival from a tense but manageable challenge into something that felt genuinely overwhelming. This was horror through escalation, through making the player juggle so many threats simultaneously that maintaining composure became nearly impossible. The most immediate and striking change from the original game is the removal of doors. Your office in this prequel location, set in a refurbished Freddy Fazbear's Pizza in 1987, has 3 entrances, a hallway directly ahead, and 2 air vents on either side. Unlike the first game, you cannot seal any of these entrances. You're completely exposed, vulnerable from multiple angles, with no hard barrier between you and the animatronics that want to reach you. This fundamental shift in defensive options changes the entire dynamic of the game, transforming it from managing resources to managing threats through different means. To compensate for this increased vulnerability, the game provides you with new tools, each with its own mechanics and strategic considerations. You have a flashlight that can shine down the hallway, though using it drains a battery that recharges slowly when not in use. You have a Freddy Fazbear mask, an empty animatronic head that you can put on to fool most of the robots into thinking you're one of them. And you have the music box in Prize Corner, which must be wound up regularly through the camera system or the marionette, one of the new animatronics. I will emerge and end your night regardless of any other defenses you employ. This music box mechanic introduces something the first game only hinted at, a non-negotiable task that must be performed regardless of everything else happening. In the original game, you could theoretically ignore the cameras entirely if you were willing to accept the risk. But in FNAF 2, neglecting the music box guarantees failure. This creates a baseline pressure that never relents, a ticking clock within the larger countdown to 6 a.m. that forces you to regularly expose yourself by raising the camera tablet, leaving you temporarily unable to see threats approaching your office. The expanded cast of animatronics multiplies the complexity exponentially. The old animatronics from the first game, now withered and decrepit, are still active. Withered Freddy, withered Bonnie, withered Chica, and withered Foxy all return with modified behaviors that must be countered in different ways. But they're joined by the new toy animatronics: Toy Freddy, Toy Bonnie, Toy Chica, Mangle, and Balloon Boy, each with their own unique patterns and threat profiles. Add in the Marionette and Golden Freddy, and you're tracking up to 12 different entities, each requiring different defensive responses. This is where FNAF 2 begins to feel genuinely overwhelming in a way the first game rarely did. You cannot possibly monitor all these threats simultaneously. You must prioritize, make quick judgments about which animatronics are immediate dangers and which can be ignored for the moment. When you pull up the camera tablet to wind the music box, you're committing to several seconds where you cannot see your office. I cannot shine your flashlight, cannot defend yourself. When you put on the Freddy mask to fool an animatronic standing in your office, you're temporarily blind to everything else approaching. Each animatronic has specific counters that you must learn through pattern recognition and often painful trial and error. The toy animatronics are generally fooled by wearing the Freddy mask, so when you see one of them in your office, you immediately grab the mask and wait for them to leave. But Withered Foxy requires you to shine your flashlight on him multiple times when he's in the hallway, or he'll climb into the office and attack regardless of the mask. Balloon Boy can enter through the vents and will disable your flashlight if he reaches you, making you vulnerable to other threats. Our Mangle can crawl along the ceiling and must be spotted on the cameras to be deterred. The Marionette, however, operates on completely different rules. It cannot be fooled by the mask. It cannot be deterred by the flashlight. Once the music box runs down completely, it emerges from Prize Corner and approaches through the hallways, visible only briefly on cameras before it reaches your office and triggers an unavoidable jump scare. This makes the music box the game's highest priority maintenance task, the one thing you absolutely cannot afford to neglect no matter what else is happening. The addition of audio cues becomes even more critical in this environment of overwhelming threats. You can often hear animatronics in the vents before you see them on the cameras, giving you precious seconds to prepare. And different characters make distinct sounds. Foxy's running, Balloon Boy's laugh, the Marionette's music box melody growing louder as it approaches. The game trains you to respond to these audio warnings instinctively, creating a Pavlovian relationship between certain sounds and specific defensive actions. The vent system adds a claustrophobic element that enhances the feeling of being surrounded. Unlike the hallways in the first game, which at least gave you a clear line of sight, the vents are blind spots you can only check through cameras, and by the time you spot an animatronic in the vents, it's often too late to prevent them from reaching your location. You're forced to check these cameras regularly, balancing vent monitoring with hallway watches, music box winding, and the constant awareness of your battery level draining with every second of flashlight use. The flashlight battery mechanic creates a resource management element that's less forgiving than the power system in the original game. The battery depletes quickly when the flashlight is on, and while it does recharge, the recharge rate is slow enough that you cannot afford to shine the light continuously. This means you must use the flashlight in short, deliberate bursts, checking the hallway just long enough to identify threats before clicking it off to conserve battery. It's a more active form of resource management, requiring constant input rather than the passive power drain of the first game. What makes FNAF 2 particularly overwhelming is how all these systems interact and demand simultaneous attention. You might be winding the music box when you hear Foxy running down the hallway, forcing you to drop the camera, shine your flashlight on him multiple times, then return to the camera to finish winding before the marionette's timer runs out. Meanwhile, Toy Freddy could be approaching your office from the hallway, requiring you to put on the mask just as Balloon Boy laughs in the left vent, meaning you need to check that camera while masked. The game becomes a frantic exercise in threat triage and rapid context switching that's mentally exhausting in a way the first game's more straightforward challenges never were. Critics had mixed reactions to this increased complexity. Metacritic assigned the game a score of 62, notably lower than the first game's 78, with reviewers split on whether the additional mechanics enhanced or detracted from the experience. Mitch Vogel of Nintendo Life found the difficulty punishing and the jump scares excessive, arguing that the constant pressure of managing so many threats made the game stressful rather than scary. PC Gamer's review noted that the difficult gameplay took away from the horror and atmosphere, suggesting that being too busy to feel afraid was a fundamental problem with the game's approach. However, other reviewers appreciated how the new mechanics forced evolution in the formula. Destructoid and Touch Arcade found the introduction of new mechanics and animatronics creatively enriching, even if the execution was imperfect. The game succeeded in making players feel genuinely overwhelmed, which is itself a form of horror. There's something terrifying about realizing you cannot possibly keep track of everything that's trying to kill you, that no matter how good your strategies are, you will inevitably miss something in the chaos. The visual design of FNAF 2 reflects its theme of overwhelming threats through abundance. The building itself feels more expansive than the first game's location, with more rooms visible on the camera system and more detailed environments. The toy animatronics are bright, colorful, and somehow more unsettling than their withered counterparts because of how aggressively cheerful they appear. Their design plays heavily on the uncanny valley effect. These robots that look more advanced and child-friendly than the originals, yet their dead eyes and too perfect movements make them feel alien and wrong. The withered animatronics, meanwhile, represent decay and malfunction given physical form. Withered Bonnie's face has been completely removed, exposing the endoskeleton skull beneath. Withered Chica's jaw hangs open at an unnatural angle. Withered Foxy is missing large sections of costume, revealing the metal framework underneath. These designs emphasize body horror in a way the first game's relatively intact animatronics didn't, making each encounter with them feel like facing something that should be dead but refuses to stop moving. The marionette stands out as particularly disturbing in its design and behavior. Tall and impossibly thin, with a white mask-like face painted with tears, it moves with an eerie fluidity that's different from the mechanical jerking of the other animatronics. When it emerges from the prize corner, it doesn't walk or run, but seems to glide, flowing through the hallways like a nightmare given form. Its jump scare is one of the most unnerving in the entire series, as it lunges directly at the camera with its face filling the screen, accompanied by a distorted version of its own music box melody. The minigames between nights add a narrative weight that enhances the overall sense of dread. These Atari-style sequences, presenting as simple arcade games, gradually reveal the dark history of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza through symbolism and implication. You witness a puppet giving gifts and life to fallen children. You see a yellow-suited figure committing murders. These fragments of story don't provide clear answers, but they establish that the animatronic's hostility isn't random malfunction. There's something intentional behind it, something tied to terrible events that occurred in this place. The phone calls in FNAF 2 take on an even more disturbing tone than in the original. Phone Guy mentions the animatronic's facial recognition system being tied to a criminal database, supposedly making them safer. But clearly something has gone wrong. Or perhaps the animatronics have decided that everyone looks like a threat. He describes previous incidents, mentions investigations, and his increasingly nervous tone suggests he knows more than he's saying. By the end of the week, his warnings become more urgent, and the implication that something terrible is building toward an inevitable conclusion hangs over every shift. The bite of 87, mentioned in the first game but occurring during the events of this one, looms over the entire experience. You're living through the final days before a catastrophic incident that will lead to major policy changes for the company. This dramatic irony creates a sense of doom that cannot be avoided. The knowledge that no matter how well you survive each night, the establishment itself is doomed. This adds a layer of futility to your struggle, a recognition that you're not preventing tragedy but merely delaying your participation in it. The multiple endings available in FNAF 2, based on completing different challenges, added replayability while also deepening the mystery. Depending on your actions across the week, you could see different newspaper clippings and minigames that filled in more of the story. This encouraged the community theorizing that would become a hallmark of the franchise, as players compared notes and tried to piece together the timeline and true nature of the murders and possessions underlying the gameplay. FNAF2's greatest achievement, despite or perhaps because of its divisive difficulty, was proving that the formula established in the first game could be expanded in meaningful ways. It demonstrated that horror could come from feeling overwhelmed, from having too many threats, and not enough time or tools to handle them all perfectly. It showed that complexity could enhance dread if implemented in ways that forced difficult choices and impossible juggling acts. While some players found this approach too stressful to be enjoyable, others appreciated how it pushed the boundaries of what survival horror could demand from players. The game also established patterns that would become franchise staples. The use of minigames for lore, the introduction of unique animatronics with special mechanics, the inclusion of multiple endings tied to secret challenges. FNAF2 might not have achieved the elegant simplicity of the original, but it laid groundwork for the series' future evolution, showing that Scott Cawthon was willing to experiment with the formula rather than simply repeating what worked before. Atmospheric horror. FNAF 3's Isolation. After the overwhelming chaos of Five Nights at Freddy's 2, where players juggled a dozen threats simultaneously, the third entry in the series took a radically different approach. Released in March 2015, Five Nights at Freddy's 3 stripped away the multitude of animatronics and complex mechanics and returning to a more focused experience centered on a single physical threat. But what it removed in mechanical complexity, it replaced with something arguably more insidious. An atmosphere of decay, isolation, and psychological torment that made the horror feel more existential than immediate. The setting itself represents a conscious shift from the previous game's operational pizzerias to something more disturbing. Fazbear's Fright, a horror attraction built to capitalize on the urban legend surrounding Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Set 30 years after the closure of the original location, this isn't even a place pretending to be family entertainment anymore. It's explicitly designed to frighten people, filled with old props and relics salvaged from the shuttered restaurants, making it a museum of trauma that invites visitors to experience secondhand the terrors that traumatized others. You're the night security guard for this attraction's opening week, monitoring systems and ensuring nothing goes wrong before the grand opening. This meta-horror setup creates several layers of unease. You're not just surviving against hostile animatronics. You're surviving in a place built to celebrate and commercialize those very horrors, a location that treats tragedy and death as entertainment. The exploitation implicit in Fazbear's Fright's existence adds a moral dimension to the dread, making the environment feel tainted in a way the earlier game's ostensibly innocent pizzerias didn't. This is horror aware of its own history and profiting from it, and there's something deeply unsettling about that self-consciousness. The single physical threat in FNAF 3 is Springtrap, a deteriorating animatronic rabbit suit that hides something far more disturbing. The corpse of a murder victim, possibly the murderer himself trapped in the machine he once used for killing. Springtrap's design is immediately striking for how it emphasizes decay and damage. Large sections of the suit have rotted away, revealing the mechanisms beneath and horrifyingly what appears to be mummified human remains visible through the gaps. This isn't a robot that happens to look frightening. This is something that was once alive, or contains something that was, and the line between machine and corpse has blurred into nightmare. Springtrap's behavior is more sophisticated than the animatronics in previous games, and creating a cat-and-mouse dynamic that's less about timing and more about spatial awareness. He moves through the attraction's rooms in semi-predictable patterns, but he's influenced by environmental factors that you can manipulate. The facility contains audio devices in various rooms that can play children's voices to lure Springtrap away from your location. Camera systems can sometimes be used to distract him, but he's learning, adapting, becoming harder to fool as the nights progress. This creates a predator-prey relationship that feels more dynamic than the largely preset patterns of earlier games. However, Springtrap isn't the only threat you face in Fazbear's Fright. The attraction is plagued by phantom animatronics, hallucinatory versions of characters from previous games that appear without warning to disrupt your defensive systems. These phantoms, Phantom Freddy, Phantom Chica, Phantom Foxy, Phantom Balloon Boy, Phantom Mangle, and Phantom Puppet, cannot directly kill you. Instead, they jump scare you and cause critical systems to fail. Your ventilation shuts down, your camera feed glitches out, your audio devices malfunction. These system failures leave you vulnerable to Springtrap or create confusion that makes tracking him more difficult. The phantom animatronics represent something psychologically interesting. Threats that harm you, not through direct action, but by eroding your ability to defend yourself. They're jump scares that don't end the game, but force you to deal with consequences that might lead to your death later. And this creates a different kind of tension than the earlier games. You're not just watching for immediate threats, you're also monitoring your systems, managing malfunctions, trying to maintain operational capacity, while a genuinely dangerous entity hunts you through the building. The ventilation system becomes a central mechanic that adds another layer to the survival challenge. When your ventilation fails due to phantom attacks or random malfunctions, toxic fumes begin filling your office. If you don't reboot the ventilation before the contamination reaches critical levels, you start hallucinating more intensely, seeing phantom animatronics even when they're not there, making it increasingly difficult to distinguish real threats from manufactured ones. And this mechanic ties physical danger to psychological deterioration in a way that's deeply unsettling. The audio system represents your primary tool for managing Springtrap's location. You can play recordings of children's voices in different rooms to lure him away from your office, creating opportunities to reboot systems or simply breathe without the immediate pressure of his approach. But these audio lures aren't perfect. Springtrap sometimes ignores them. Sometimes he seems to recognize the trick and stops responding. The systems themselves can fail, leaving you unable to create distractions when you need them most. This unreliability transforms what could have been a simple mechanic into a source of constant anxiety. The camera system, a staple of the series, takes on different qualities in FNAF 3. Rather than multiple animatronics to track across a dozen camera feeds, you're primarily focused on finding and monitoring one target, Springtrap. But the cameras themselves are unreliable, frequently glitching out or failing entirely due to phantom attacks or system degradation. When your vision goes dark and you hear the static of camera malfunction, you know that Springtrap could be anywhere, potentially moving into positions that will make your survival significantly harder. The game weaponizes the loss of information itself, making the moments when you cannot see more frightening than what you might see on the working feeds. The atmosphere of Fazbear's fright contributes enormously to the overall sense of dread. Unlike the colorful, brightly lit pizzerias of the earlier games, this location is deliberately decrepit. Walls are stained and cracked. Lighting is dim and uneven, creating pools of shadow where your imagination fills in threats. The decorations are old props and drawings, relics of tragedies past that have been assembled into a grotesque collage. This isn't just a dangerous place. It's a sick place, infected with the psychic residue of everything terrible that happened in the locations it's trying to recreate. The sound design in FNAF 3 is perhaps the most effective in the series up to this point. The building creaks and groans constantly, making you question every sound's origin. Springtrap's movements are accompanied by mechanical shuffling and the wet sounds of deteriorating organic material shifting inside a robotic shell. The phantom animatronics' appearances are heralded by distorted audio that plays on your memory of their original sounds. Ventilation failure brings with it an increasing hiss of gas and the thickening of ambient sounds, as if the air itself is becoming hostile. The phone calls in this game come from a new speaker, a much more casual and excited employee who treats the attraction as a fun project, rather than the horror show it actually is. His enthusiasm about finding Springtrap, about having a real animatronic to display, creates a jarring contrast with the player's experience of that discovery. He talks about how amazing it is to have authentic items from the old locations, completely oblivious to or unconcerned by the implications of those items' histories. This tonal disconnect enhances the sense that something is deeply wrong with the entire enterprise of Fazbear's Fright. The minigames between nights in FNAF 3 are crucial for understanding the series' larger narrative. These sequences show the destruction of the original animatronics, with a figure in a security guard uniform dismantling them one by one, only to be confronted by the spirits of the murdered children. In the final minigame, this figure retreats to a safe room and hides inside the Spring Bonnie suit, only for the spring lock mechanisms to fail catastrophically, crushing and killing him inside the costume. The evidence strongly suggests this figure is William Afton, the murderer from previous games, meaning Springtrap's true nature becomes clear. He's not just a haunted animatronic, but a tomb containing the corpse of the man responsible for the murders that started everything. This revelation adds a dimension to the horror that's different from the earlier games. You're not being hunted by a malfunctioning machine, or even by vengeful spirits trapped in metal. You're being hunted by something that chose its fate, that hid inside that suit and suffered a gruesome death that somehow didn't end its existence. Springtrap represents sin and suffering that refuses to die, evil that persists beyond physical destruction, and that knowledge makes every encounter with him feel like facing something fundamentally wrong with reality itself. Critics were divided on FNAF 3's approach to horror. The game received a Metacritic score of 68, with reviewers appreciating the improved mechanics and updated camera system, but feeling that the atmosphere and story received mixed execution. Omri Petit of PC Gamer praised the horror aspect of Springtrap, but believed the Phantom animatronics lacked the personality of their original counterparts and felt repetitious. Mitch Vogel of Nintendo Life wrote that the Phantom animatronics were unnecessary and considered the weaker horror aspects to be a trade-off with the improved mechanics. However, there's an argument to be made that FNAF 3's horror operates on a different wavelength than the earlier games, and traditional review metrics might not capture what it accomplishes. This isn't about jump scare frequency or the intensity of moment-to-moment gameplay. It's about sustained unease. About the feeling of being alone in a cursed place where the walls themselves feel hostile. The isolation is the horror. The knowledge that you're the only living person in a building dedicated to celebrating death and trauma is the horror. The recognition that Springtrap was once human and chose this existence is the horror. The good ending available through completing secret challenges adds a note of potential redemption to the horror. Players who find and complete the hidden minigames correctly can trigger an ending where the spirits of the murdered children are finally laid to rest, their masks falling away to reveal the children beneath, followed by a shot of empty heads and a quiet celebration. This suggests that the cycle of violence and possession might be broken, that the horror has an endpoint. But even this hopeful conclusion is undercut by the post-credits scene, showing Springtrap's burned suit among the debris after a fire destroys Fazbear's Fright, one silver eye still glowing in the darkness. Some evils, it seems, cannot be destroyed by conventional means. The fire itself represents an interesting narrative choice. The final newspaper clipping mentions that Fazbear's Fright burned down shortly after opening, with the cause unknown, and everything of value sold at auction. This echoes the fate of the previous Freddy locations, suggesting a pattern where these places ultimately self-destruct, as if the horror they contain becomes too much for the physical structure to sustain. But the survival of Springtrap implies that destroying the building isn't enough, that the evil embedded in these animatronics, or in the man inside this particular one, persists beyond the elimination of its environment. FNAF3's legacy in the franchise's evolution is significant, despite its mixed reception. It proved that the series didn't need a dozen threats to be effective, that a single well-designed antagonist could carry an entire game if the atmosphere and mechanics supported that focus. It demonstrated that psychological horror, the horror of knowing what something is and what it represents, could be as effective as the more immediate horror of survival under pressure. And it showed that the series was willing to engage with its own mythology in deeper ways, using gameplay and minigames to build toward narrative revelations rather than just using story as window dressing for mechanics. The game's exploration of guilt, punishment, and the persistence of evil would influence later entries in the series, particularly in how they handled the recurring villain who would become central to the franchise's mythology. FNAF3's Springtrap represented horror that was personal rather than random, suffering that had origin and meaning, and that shift toward horror with narrative weight would become increasingly important as the series continued to evolve. Psychological terror, FNAF 4's Nightmare Realm. When Five Nights at Freddy's 4 launched in July 2015, it represented the most radical departure from the series' established formula, yet attempted. Where previous games placed you in commercial locations defending against mechanical threats, the fourth entry brought the horror into a space that should be the safest, a child's bedroom at night. And this wasn't just a change of setting, but a fundamental shift in the nature of the threat and the type of fear the game sought to create. F4 is personal horror, intimate horror, the kind that exploits childhood fears and primal anxieties in ways the earlier game's workplace settings never could. The game positions you as a young child, widely believed to be the crying child from the series' ongoing narrative, cowering in your bedroom as nightmarish versions of the Freddy Fazbear characters attempt to breach your sanctuary. You have no security cameras, no doors that seal, no technological barrier between you and the things in the dark. Your only defenses are a flashlight, the ability to check the hallways and closet, and your hearing. In this stripping away of the surveillance and barrier mechanics that define the first three games forces an entirely different approach to survival. One based not on information management, but on listening, timing, and nerve. The nightmare animatronics that hunt you through the darkness are grotesque exaggerations of their normal counterparts, twisted into forms that look less like malfunctioning robots and more like physical manifestations of terror. Nightmare Bonnie, Nightmare Chica, Nightmare Foxy, Nightmare Freddy, and later Nightmare Fredbear, and the simply named Nightmare are covered in sharp teeth and claws, their bodies broken and torn in ways that expose muscle-like tissue and skeletal structures beneath deteriorating costumes. These aren't machines that look scary. These are monsters that happen to be shaped like animatronics, occupying some disturbing space between mechanical and organic horror. The design of these nightmare forms plays heavily on body horror and the fear of predators. The teeth in particular are emphasized in every design, rows upon rows of sharp fangs that fill mouths stretched into impossible dimensions. The claws are similarly exaggerated, long and sharp and clearly designed for rending. This explicit predatory design is different from the earlier game's animatronics, which looked menacing but still maintained their entertainment robot forms. The Nightmare animatronics look like they were built specifically to hunt and kill, which from a psychological standpoint makes them more frightening, because their form matches their function perfectly. The bedroom setting itself is brilliant for creating vulnerability, and this is supposed to be a safe space. A child's room decorated with plush toys and familiar objects, the place where you should be protected from the dangers of the outside world. But in FNAF 4, this safety is completely inverted. The bed provides no protection. The toys are just decoration. The darkness beyond the doorways and inside the closet could hide anything, and you are completely alone with no adult supervision, no help coming, no one to call out to. This exploitation of childhood fears of monsters under the bed and things in the closet taps into primal anxieties that many players have experienced but hoped they'd outgrown. The audio-based gameplay represents the most significant mechanical innovation in FNAF 4. Without cameras, you must rely almost entirely on sound to determine whether animatronics are present at the doorways. And when you approach a door, you listen for breathing. If you hear breathing, you close the door and wait for the animatronic to leave. If you don't hear breathing, you can flash your light down the hall to check if anyone's approaching. But if you flash the light when an animatronic is at the door, they immediately kill you. This creates a terrifying decision point every single time you check a door. Are you absolutely certain about what you heard or didn't hear? This listening mechanic forces an unusual kind of attention from players. You must turn up your volume and focus intensely on subtle audio cues, distinguishing between the ambient sounds of the house settling and the specific pattern of an animatronic's breathing. The game uses silence as effectively as sound, and those moments where you hear nothing and must decide if that nothing is safe or if you simply missed the breathing cue that would have saved your life. This auditory focus creates a different kind of tension than visual monitoring, one that's more intimate and harder to distance yourself from because you're processing sounds your own ears register rather than watching a screen within a screen. The closet adds another dimension to this audio-focused gameplay. Nightmare Foxy lurks inside, his progression through several stages indicated by how far the closet door has opened and whether you can see him crouching inside. You must check the closet regularly with your flashlight and close the door if Foxy is visible, but you cannot keep the door closed permanently, or he'll emerge anyway. This creates yet another timing challenge, another thing to monitor and respond to correctly, while also managing the door threats and checking on the bed. The bed itself becomes the staging ground for another threat, Nightmare Freddy and his 3 smaller Freddle minions. If you neglect to check the bed by turning around and flashing your light on it, Freddles accumulate, and when enough gather, Nightmare Freddy himself manifests to end your night. This forces you to regularly turn your back on the doorways and closet, leaving yourself vulnerable to whatever might be approaching from those directions during the seconds you're facing the opposite way. The bed threat creates paranoia about what's happening behind you, adding to the sense that you're surrounded and cannot adequately defend all angles simultaneously. Nightmare Fredbear, who appears on Night 5, and Nightmare, who appears on subsequent challenges, represent the ultimate forms of these horror designs. Nightmare Fredbear is massive and clearly more aggressive than the other animatronics, attacking from multiple locations including the bed, closet, and both doors. Nightmare takes this further, appearing as a shadowy, almost translucent version of Fredbear with human organs visible in some images when brightened, creating a visual that's deeply disturbing in its implications about what this entity might actually be. The minigames between nights tell the tragic story of a young boy, tormented by his older brother and his friends, who wear masks of the animatronic characters. These sequences show him being bullied, locked in rooms, and ultimately placed headfirst into Fredbear's mouth in a cruel prank that goes catastrophically wrong. And based on the 1983 dates shown throughout these minigames, this incident is widely interpreted as the bite of 83, though the game leaves room for interpretation about how this connects to the larger timeline. The nightmare animatronics could represent this child's terror of these characters transformed by trauma into the worst possible versions they could be. This narrative context reframes the entire game's horror in ways that feel deeply personal. The evidence suggests you're experiencing something tied to this traumatic event, though whether you're playing as the child himself or someone connected to these memories remains open to interpretation. The beeping sound in the background of gameplay, which echoes the heart monitor heard in the final minigame, implies that these nightmares might be occurring in a hospital setting, with consciousness trapped between life and death. This reading transforms the gameplay from visceral survival horror into psychological tragedy, where the true enemy isn't just the animatronics, but the trauma and fear they represent. The plush Fredbear that appears in the minigames, speaking to the child with promises to protect him and eventually claiming, "I will put you back together," adds another layer of disturbing ambiguity that has fueled extensive community debate. The nature of this plush and who might be speaking through it remains one of the game's most discussed mysteries. Some interpretations suggest it represents a comforting presence in the child's imagination, while others theorize it could indicate something more sinister, possibly manipulation from someone with darker intentions. The plush's exact nature and the meaning of its final promise have never been definitively confirmed, but its presence throughout the child's ordeal creates an additional current of unease in what should be comforting imagery. Critics had mixed reactions to FNAF4's approach to horror. Mitch Vogel of Nintendo Life described it as the most frightening in the series, though he also found the jump scares jarring in a way that made the horror elements feel less effective overall. Angelo M. D'Argenio of The Escapist praised the reworked mechanics and story, calling it perfect for fans of the series. However, some reviewers found the gameplay to have little variety or strategy once its patterns were learned, suggesting that the audio-based mechanics became repetitive over multiple nights. The game's atmosphere and sound design received widespread praise for their effectiveness in creating genuine unease. The use of darkness is particularly masterful, with your flashlight illuminating only small areas and leaving vast portions of the room in shadow that your imagination populates with threats. The hallway lights reveal just enough to show animatronics approaching, but not enough to make you feel secure. Every pool of darkness could hide something, and the game's visual design ensures you're constantly second-guessing what you're seeing or not seeing at the edges of your illumination. The audio design is similarly excellent, using silence as effectively as sound to maintain constant tension. The house's ambient noises, footsteps, breathing, and the distant sound of the heart monitor all contribute to a soundscape that keeps you perpetually on edge. The breathing sounds that indicate an animatronic's presence at a door are subtle enough that you must really listen for them, and the penalty for misidentifying or missing these cues is immediate and brutal. This forces a level of auditory attention that most games don't require, making the horror more immersive because you cannot distance yourself from it through visual abstraction. The visual design of the nightmare animatronics themselves deserves particular recognition for how effectively they evoke primal fear responses. The excessive teeth and claws trigger instinctive recognition of predator features. The damaged, deteriorating appearance suggests disease and decay. The way they're too large for the spaces they occupy, and having to crouch or lean in doorways, emphasizes their inhuman scale, and the occasional glimpses of something organic beneath the mechanical exterior blur the line between robot and monster in deeply unsettling ways. The multiple endings and secret challenges in FNAF 4 add replayability while also deepening the mystery around the game's true meaning. Completing all the nightmare challenges unlocks access to a box that cannot be opened, with the game stating that perhaps some things are best left forgotten for now. This deliberate withholding of final answers maintains the ambiguity that has become central to the franchise's appeal, leaving players to theorize and debate the true nature of what they've experienced. FNAF4's legacy in the franchise is significant for several reasons. It proved that the series could work in a completely different setting with fundamentally altered mechanics and still maintain the core of what makes it frightening. It demonstrated that audio-based horror could be as effective as visual horror if implemented with enough care and precision. It showed that personal, intimate horror could be more psychologically impactful than the workplace survival horror of the earlier games. And it established that the series was willing to explore darker narrative territory, dealing with child trauma and death in ways that added emotional weight to the mechanical challenges. The game's exploration of nightmare logic, where the rules of reality don't apply and your bedroom can become a death trap, would influence future entries in the franchise, and particularly in how they approach dream sequences and psychological horror. FNAF4 represented horror becoming deeply personal, moving from the professional distance of security guard shifts into the vulnerable intimacy of a child's bedroom, and that shift toward more personal stakes would continue to evolve in subsequent games. Cinematic fear. Sister Location's theatrical horror. In October 2016, Five Nights at Freddy's, Sister Location launched and immediately distinguished itself as the most narratively ambitious and mechanically varied entry in the franchise to date. Where previous games had maintained relatively consistent core gameplay loops across 5 or 6 nights, Sister Location abandoned that structure entirely, creating what felt more like an interactive horror story than a traditional survival game. Each night brought completely new mechanics, different locations, and scenarios that felt designed to showcase the horror potential of specific situations rather than testing mastery of a single set of skills. The setting alone represented a departure from anything the series had attempted before. Rather than a public-facing pizzeria or attraction, Sister Location takes place in a private underground facility called Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rental, a location designed for dispatching animatronics to private parties during the day. This shift to a hidden industrial environment changes the entire aesthetic, from the familiar decay of old pizzerias to something more sterile and deliberately designed. The facility feels less like a location that deteriorated over time and more like something purposefully built for functions that might not bear close examination. You play as a technician performing maintenance on the animatronics over the course of a work week, guided by an artificial intelligence system and occasionally by one of the animatronics themselves. This role change from security guard to active worker, who must approach and interact with the threats rather than simply defending against them, creates entirely different dynamics. You're not monitoring distant rooms on cameras. You're in the same space as these machines, close enough to touch them, with nothing between you and them except the expectation that they'll remain in maintenance mode. The animatronics themselves represent a new generation of characters with more sophisticated designs and disturbing capabilities. Circus Baby, the titular character of the location, is a clown-like figure whose cheerful appearance masks sinister purpose. Ballora, a graceful ballerina with permanently closed eyes, moves with unsettling elegance. Funtime Freddy and Funtime Foxy maintain familiar names, but with redesigned aesthetics that emphasize the fun in their titles through an almost aggressive cheerfulness that feels threatening in its intensity. These aren't decaying relics from past tragedies. They're sleek, modern machines that might be even more dangerous precisely because they function as intended. The most striking mechanical innovation in Sister Location is how each night presents completely different gameplay. Our Night 1 has you navigating between rooms, learning the facility's layout while being observed by animatronics in glass chambers. Night 2 puts you underneath a desk trying to remain motionless while Ballora circles the room, detected by audio cues rather than visual ones. Night 3 involves multiple stages, including typing correct protocols while being watched, navigating a spring-lock suit that could kill you if you move incorrectly, and participating in a simulated children's birthday party. Night 4 presents new areas and mechanics entirely. This variety means the game never settles into a comfortable rhythm, constantly throwing new challenges and fears at you before you can adapt. The spring-lock suit sequence deserves particular attention for how it creates horror through restricted movement and consequences, and you're guided to enter a maintenance suit that uses spring-lock mechanisms, the same technology that would prove fatal to the murderer in FNAF 3. As you wear the suit, you must carefully manage your breathing and movements, while simultaneously fending off minarinas, small puppet-like animatronics that climb onto the suit and threaten to trigger the spring locks. One wrong movement, too rapid a breath, and the locks fail, impaling you with machinery in an agonizing death that the game doesn't show but forces you to imagine. This sequence creates anxiety through the threat of self-caused harm, where your own panic responses become the danger. The elevator rides between sections serve as moments of increasing tension and often feature conversations with Circus Baby, who provides guidance that seems helpful, but carries undertones of manipulation. Her voice, acting warm and almost maternal, contrasts sharply with the information she provides about the facility and its animatronics. She describes functions and capabilities that sound increasingly designed for purposes that have nothing to do with entertainment. She mentions that the animatronics can recognize voices, track children, and contain them. The implications are deeply disturbing, suggesting these machines were built not just to entertain, but to capture. The narrative revelations throughout Sister Location transform understanding of the entire franchise's lore. Through Baby's own dialogue during the game, we learn that you are Michael Afton, son of William Afton, who has been established as the murderer from previous games. And Baby herself reveals in her monologue that she was responsible for the death of a young girl during a private demonstration. A girl who was drawn to the ice cream dispenser despite being warned to stay away. The game strongly implies through context and subsequent lore, that this victim was Elizabeth Afton, William's daughter and Michael's sister. This family connection transforms your mission from a job into something personal, adding emotional weight to your survival that previous games lacked. The private room sequence on Night 5 brings back the familiar camera-based survival gameplay, but with the knowledge that you're being observed just as much as you're observing. The animatronics know you're there. They know what you're trying to do. And the facility itself seems designed to trap you rather than protect you. So this inversion of the security room concept, turning the safe observation post into a cell, feels like the series commenting on its own mechanics, acknowledging that watching from a protected space only provides the illusion of safety. The true ending of Sister Location is arguably the most disturbing sequence in the entire franchise. Following Baby's instructions, you descend into the scooping room, where animatronics have their endoskeletons removed. But this isn't maintenance, it's betrayal. The animatronics have fused into a single entity called Enard, a tangled mass of wires and parts from multiple characters, and they need a disguise to escape the facility. The scooping mechanism is used on you, removing your internal organs and allowing Enard to wear your hollowed-out body as a costume. You watch this happen. I watch your character's eyes go dark, and then witness the aftermath. Your skin turning purple as it decays, Enard eventually abandoning the rotting flesh, and your corpse somehow standing back up, animated by remnants of whatever force keeps things moving in the FNAF universe. This ending sequence is body horror at its most visceral. The game forces you to participate in your own death and hollowing out, then continues past that death to show the disgusting consequences of a reanimated corpse shambling through suburban neighborhoods. The voice acting in the post-credit scene, with Michael's voice echoing from a decaying throat promising to find his father, creates horror that's both physical and existential. You're playing as something that should be dead but refuses to stop, driven by purpose that transcends biological death. The voice acting throughout Sister Location represents another major evolution for the franchise. Previous games had minimal voice work beyond phone calls. Sister Location features extensive dialogue from multiple characters, all performed by professional actors who bring personality and menace to their roles. Circus Baby's voice has a warmth that makes her manipulations more effective. Ballora's recorded messages play on maternal comfort turned threatening. Funtime Freddy's enthusiastic lunacy in the private room segments creates a manic energy that's disturbing in its intensity. This audio work transforms the game from a largely silent experience to something more cinematic, more story-focused, and more character-driven. The exotic butter sequence, while ultimately serving as a punchline that became a massive meme in the community, also functions as effective horror through anticlimax. After surviving multiple nights of terror, your reward for exemplary performance is a basket of butter and a casual bongos game, instead of the job promotion you expected. This pathetic joke amid the horror creates cognitive dissonance that some players found funny and others found unsettling, in how it undermined the significance of everything you'd endured. The game treats your survival as worth less than a basket of butter, and there's something deeply dark about that casual dismissal. Critics and players had mixed responses to Sister Location's departures from franchise formula. Those invested in the lore appreciated the narrative revelations and character development, and those seeking traditional FNAF gameplay found the constant mechanical changes disorienting and sometimes felt the variety came at the expense of depth, with each night's mechanics being mastered just as they were being abandoned. The game's focus on story over gameplay refinement divided the community between those who wanted more narrative context and those who preferred the earlier game's mechanical purity. However, Sister Location's influence on the franchise's future evolution cannot be overstated. It proved that FNAF could support complex narratives with character arcs and emotional stakes beyond pure survival. It demonstrated that voice acting could enhance rather than detract from the horror when implemented with care. It showed that mechanical variety could maintain engagement across nights that might otherwise feel repetitive. And established that the series was willing to take narrative risks, including body horror and family tragedy that gave personal stakes to the larger story being told. The game's exploration of the Afton family dynamics would become central to the franchise's ongoing narrative. Connecting previous games' events into a generational tragedy where sins of fathers are visited upon children in increasingly horrible ways. William Afton's legacy of murder and experimentation with animatronics and Remnant, the mysterious life force that allows spirits to inhabit machines, creates a through line that ties scattered incidents into a family history of horror that's both personal and systematic. The Circus Babies entertainment and rental facility itself represents something important in the franchise's evolution. Horror that's designed rather than incidental. The earlier game's pizzerias had tragedy happen to them. This facility was built with terrible purposes in mind, with animatronics specifically designed to capture rather than simply entertain. This shift from locations where things went wrong to locations where things are working exactly as their designer intended adds a layer of premeditation to the horror that makes it feel more malevolent. Sister Location's legacy includes proving that the FNAF formula could accommodate radical experimentation while still maintaining the core of what makes the franchise frightening. It showed that horror could come from story revelations as much as mechanical challenges, from understanding the implications of what you're witnessing rather than simply reacting to immediate threats. And it demonstrated that sometimes the most disturbing horror comes not from what happens to you during gameplay, but from what you discover happened before you arrived and what continues after you leave. The horror of being a small part of something much larger and more terrible than you initially realized. The culmination. Pizzeria simulators. Deceptive calm. In December 2017, what appeared to be a simple business simulation game called Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator launched on Steam, seemingly representing a departure from the horror that defined the franchise. Players were invited to design their own pizzeria, purchase attractions and decorations, serve customers, and manage finances in what looked like a light-hearted tycoon game. But this deception, this mask of normalcy hiding something darker beneath, proved to be the most thematically appropriate wrapper possible for what was actually Five Nights at Freddy's 6, a game about bringing all the franchise's horrors together for a final confrontation disguised as opportunity. The business simulation aspect is entirely functional and surprisingly engaging on its own terms. You make real decisions about what equipment to buy, how to arrange your restaurant, how to balance profit against expenses and risk. The playful 8-bit graphics and cheerful music create an atmosphere of innocent fun that feels deliberately incongruous with the franchise's history. This tonal whiplash is intentional, creating a false sense of security that makes the horror elements, and when they emerge, feel more violating for how they intrude on what seemed like a safe space. Each day follows a pattern. Operate your pizzeria during business hours, completing various tasks and minigames to earn money and satisfy customers. Then, as night falls and the restaurant closes, you're presented with opportunities that bridge the simulation with survival horror. you're offered salvage, broken animatronics found in the alley behind your restaurant that you can attempt to repair and incorporate into your business. These salvage sequences are where the horror begins to seep back in, slowly at first, then with increasing intensity. The salvage process forces you into close proximity with animatronics that are clearly dangerous, testing them with audio prompts while monitoring their responses. If they become aggressive during testing, you must remain absolutely still, not moving your mouse, not clicking anything, just waiting for the threat to pass. This mechanic creates a unique form of tension, where the wrong action is any action at all, where survival comes from restraint rather than quick responses. These sequences feel like being in a room with a predator that might attack if you draw its attention, and the stillness they require is psychologically exhausting in its own way. The animatronics you encounter through salvage are deeply connected to the franchise's lore. Molten Freddy, a tangled mass of wires and parts that contains remnants of multiple spirits. Scrap Baby, the rebuilt form of Circus Baby, who still contains Elizabeth Afton's spirit. Scrap Trap, the further decayed form of William Afton's Springtrap, still refusing to die despite fire and decay. And Lefty, a mysterious bear whose true purpose becomes clear only later. Each of these characters represents unfinished business from previous games, spirits and evils that have persisted across multiple locations and tragedies. The night segments that follow successful business days return to traditional FNAF survival horror mechanics, but with a twist. You're managing systems, watching monitors, keeping animatronics at bay using sound lures and ventilation controls. But you're not in a security office. You're in the back room of your own restaurant, a space you designed and arranged, making the threat feel more personal because they're invading something you built. The animatronics you salvaged, now active and aggressive, hunt through your pizzeria alongside other threats, creating scenarios where your business decisions directly impact your survival challenges. The motion detector system that tracks animatronic positions through the building adds a layer of strategy to the traditional survival mechanics. You can see where threats are located, but the information is imperfect, sometimes glitching out or providing delayed updates. You must decide when to use audio lures to redirect animatronics away from your office, when to seal vents, when to focus on system maintenance versus threat monitoring. These decisions carry weight because the animatronics are persistent and learn your patterns, making repeated strategies less effective over time. But the true purpose of Pizzeria Simulator only becomes clear as you progress through the week and unlock the story bits that reveal the larger narrative framework. You're not running this pizzeria for profit or personal achievement. You're participating in a trap, an elaborate scheme designed by Henry Emily, the surviving co-founder of Fazbear Entertainment, to gather all the haunted animatronics in one place for a final reckoning. The restaurant is a labyrinth designed to confuse and contain, and the business simulation serves to draw in the possessed machines that have plagued the franchise's history. Henry's speech at the end of the week, delivered through a recording that plays as fire consumes the building with you and all the animatronics trapped inside, represents a powerful narrative culmination. He addresses each character trapped in the flames, the original victims, the children whose spirits were bound to machines, his own daughter Charlie, whose spirit inhabits the puppet animatronic, why Elizabeth Afton, his former friend's daughter, consumed by the machine she was warned away from, and William Afton himself, the architect of so much suffering, finally cornered and unable to escape. Henry acknowledges his own role in enabling these tragedies, his inventions and partnership providing the tools for Afton's crimes, and he accepts his responsibility by staying in the fire to ensure everything ends. This ending is remarkable for several reasons. It's a rare instance in horror gaming where the protagonist knowingly accepts death to prevent greater evil. You, the player controlling the pizzeria owner, were always meant to die in this trap. Your character volunteers for this sacrifice, understanding that breaking the cycle of possession and violence requires complete destruction of everything connected to it. This transforms the entire playthrough into a knowing march toward martyrdom, giving narrative weight to every decision you made building the restaurant that would become everyone's tomb. The good ending, unlocked by completing specific challenges and salvaging all the necessary animatronics, provides additional scenes showing the spirits finally being released from their torment. The children's faces appear briefly before fading away, suggesting peace at last. A gravestone in a quiet field presumably marks Charlie's final rest. These images of resolution are brief and understated, not triumphant, but quietly resigned, acknowledging that the path to this peace required tremendous sacrifice and left tremendous damage in its wake. Pizzeria Simulator's approach to horror is notably more subtle and psychological than previous entries. The jump scares are still present, but feel less central to the experience. The real horror comes from understanding what you're participating in, from the recognition that you're luring spirits of murdered children to their final rest and willing yourself to burn alongside them. It's horror through complicity, through knowing you're engineering everyone's death, including your own, and continuing with that knowledge, because the alternative is allowing the cycle to continue indefinitely. The game's meta-narrative elements create another layer of horror for those paying attention. The shift between cheerful simulation and survival horror mirrors the franchise's larger themes about entertainment masking tragedy, about how locations designed for joy became sites of suffering. The way the game initially presents itself as something other than a FNAF title parallels how Fazbear Entertainment within the lore consistently tries to rebrand and distance itself from past horrors, while inevitably repeating them. The player's voluntary participation in the final trap reflects the franchise's long-time questions about complicity and choice in perpetuating systems that cause harm. Critics and players appreciated Pizzeria Simulator's ambition and narrative closure, even while noting that the business simulation elements, while fun, felt somewhat disconnected from the horror segments. Rock, Paper, Shotgun and Game Crate applauded the blend of business simulation and survival horror, finding the combination creative and engaging. Others felt the two modes didn't integrate as seamlessly as they could have. How would the shift between them, feeling abrupt rather than organic? However, most agreed that the game provided a satisfying narrative conclusion to story threads that had been building across 6 games. The voice acting deserves particular mention, with Henry's final speech standing as one of the best written and most emotionally resonant moments in the entire franchise. The actor delivers his lines with a weariness and determination that conveys the weight of everything Henry has endured and sacrificed. When he says, "I'm sorry that on that day, the day you were shut out and left to die, no one was there to lift you up into their arms, the way you lifted others into yours." Addressing the puppet containing his daughter's spirit, the pain in his voice transforms what could have been expository dialogue into something genuinely moving. And Pizzeria Simulator's legacy in the franchise is about providing closure, or at least attempting to. It acknowledged that the cycle of violence and possession that defined the earlier games needed an endpoint, and it provided one through fire and deliberate sacrifice. It showed that horror doesn't always need to be about survival. Sometimes the most frightening choice is accepting death for a purpose, walking knowingly into destruction because it's the only way to stop something worse from continuing. And it demonstrated that the FNAF franchise could engage with its own history in meaningful ways, bringing characters and storylines together for a conclusion, rather than simply generating new threats in new locations. The game also refined the idea that horror could come from understanding rather than surprise, and from piecing together what's actually happening and recognizing your role in it. The more you understand about Pizzeria Simulator's true purpose, the darker your participation feels, and that intellectual horror, the horror of complicity and consequence, adds depth to the mechanical challenges. You're not just surviving nights at your restaurant. You're completing a trap that will end multiple existences, including your own. And every action you take brings that conclusion closer. Modern Evolution, Help Wanted's VR immersion. In May 2019, Five Nights at Freddy's, Help Wanted represented the most significant technological evolution in the franchise's history, bringing the horror into virtual reality and fundamentally changing how players experience the threat. For the first time, Steel Wool Studios, working closely with Scott Cawthon, I created a FNAF experience where the animatronics existed in your physical space, where turning your actual head determined what you could see, and where the scale and presence of threats became tangibly real, rather than mediated through screens within screens. This wasn't just a port or adaptation. It was a reimagining of what FNAF horror could be when given the immersive power of VR technology. The game's premise is clever and meta, positioning itself as a VR experience commissioned by Fazbear Entertainment to rehabilitate the company's image by convincing the public that all the terrible events were just stories exaggerated by an indie developer's horror games. This self-referential framing allows the game to recreate scenarios from the first 6 main titles, while acknowledging that you're playing recreations within the game's fiction, are creating layers of reality and simulation that blur in unsettling ways. The suggestion that you're being paid to help cover up real tragedies by participating in their gamification adds a current of unease beneath the surface entertainment. The VR format transforms fundamentals that were always present but abstract. In previous games, the animatronics were digital images on your monitor, frightening but bounded by the screen's edges. In Help Wanted, they exist in 3-dimensional space around you. When Foxy's damaged face leans into your office through the doorway, he's not a distant figure in a camera feed. He's right there, close enough that you could reach out and touch him if you weren't paralyzed by terror. The sense of scale is overwhelming. These machines are huge, looming over you in ways that flat-screen gaming could never convey, and that physical presence triggers instinctive fear responses that no amount of exposure to the franchise's imagery on traditional screens can prepare you for. The recreated sections from previous games take on entirely new dimensions in VR. Checking cameras requires you to physically pull up and hold a tablet in your virtual hands, then look down at it while remaining aware of the space around you that you can no longer see while focused on the feeds. Closing doors means reaching out to hit buttons positioned on either side of you, requiring you to turn your head and extend your hands. Movements that leave you temporarily focused away from the central view. These actions that were simple mouse clicks become physical commitments, and the difference between clicking a button and actually reaching out to press one while something might be approaching creates a more visceral experience of vulnerability. But Help Wanted isn't just recreations. The new scenarios created specifically for VR showcase how the format enables different types of horror than flat-screen gaming can achieve. The parts and service sections, where you perform maintenance on animatronics up close, create anxiety through proximity that's impossible in traditional FNAF. You're leaning forward, trying to remove a panel or replace a component, with an animatronic's face mere inches from your own. If you make a mistake, if you do the steps wrong or take too long, the animatronic activates, and its face lunges directly at yours, and invading your personal space in a way that triggers primal responses to physical threat. The vent repair sections exemplify VR horror done right. You're inside claustrophobic tunnels, shuffling forward by actually moving your body in limited space, your flashlight illuminating small circles of safety in overwhelming darkness. Animatronics can appear ahead of you, behind you, in side passages. And because you must physically turn your head and body to check different directions, the act of looking for threats becomes exhaustingly kinetic. The physicality of turning to check behind you, of actually pointing your flashlight rather than clicking a direction, makes the threat feel immediate and present in ways that traditional control schemes don't replicate. The scale and atmosphere of VR create passive horror that exists even during moments when nothing is actively threatening you. Walking through the Pizzaplex environments, seeing how large the spaces are, how high the ceilings reach, how shadows pool in corners beyond your flashlight's reach, creates a sense of being in an actual place, rather than playing through a game level. The audio design becomes three-dimensional, with sounds coming from specific locations in space that you can locate by listening and turning toward them. This spatial audio means you hear footsteps behind you, mechanical sounds to your left, distant children's laughter echoing from somewhere ahead, and these directional cues force constant vigilance in all directions. The glitch trap character, introduced through collectible tapes and appearing in the game itself, creates a new horror element specific to the VR experience. This digital entity, suggested to be a manifestation of William Afton's consciousness, preserved in old circuit boards that were scanned for the VR game's development, begins as a background presence before gradually becoming more prominent. He appears in the virtual environment watching you, sometimes on stage, performing for an invisible audience, sometimes standing motionless in your peripheral vision. His presence creates paranoia because he doesn't follow the rules other animatronics do. He exists in the digital space itself, meaning nowhere in the game is truly safe from his observation. The Tape Girl's recordings, hidden throughout the game, reveal disturbing background information about the VR experience's development. She describes previous testers who became erratic or obsessed after prolonged exposure, mentions unexplained occurrences during development, and warns about something malicious in the code itself. These audio logs create a horror narrative running parallel to the gameplay, suggesting that by playing this VR experience, you're exposing yourself to something dangerous, that the game itself might be a vector for possession or corruption. This meta-horror, the idea that the medium of play is itself unsafe, feels particularly relevant in VR, where the immersion is so much greater than traditional gaming. The prize counter game, which serves as a hub where you can spend coins earned through completing challenges to unlock collectibles, has a dark undercurrent once you've collected enough tapes. Glitch Trap begins appearing here, and first partially visible behind barriers, then increasingly present, until completing the hidden conditions allows him to fully manifest. The final sequence where he offers you a choice, where he shushes you as if sharing a secret before your perspective shifts, to show you've been placed inside the Freddy Fazbear suit, implies that you've been possessed or subverted, that the entity has found a way out of the game through you. This ending creates horror through implication, rather than explicit threat. The recognition that you become part of something larger and more sinister than you understood. The game's approach to difficulty balancing makes the VR format accessible, while still maintaining challenge. The recreated classic scenarios often have adjustments from their original versions of fine-tuning the timing and RNG to work better in VR, where player reaction times differ from traditional controls. The new scenarios created for VR start with gentler introductions before ramping up to genuinely challenging encounters. This progression acknowledges that VR horror is inherently more intense than flat-screen horror, and that throwing players into the deep end immediately would be overwhelming rather than fun. The game wants you to feel frightened but not so panicked that you want to remove the headset and stop playing. Critics widely praised Help Wanted's use of VR technology. The PlayStation 4 version earned a Metacritic score of 80, significantly higher than most entries in the main franchise. Upload VR called it a masterclass in suspense and described it as one of the scariest VR horror games available. IGN Italia and other reviewers noted how the immersion made familiar scenarios feel new and more frightening, with a sense of presence transforming jump scares from anticipated shocks into genuinely startling experiences. The consensus was that VR brought new life to the FNAF formula by changing the fundamental relationship between player and threat. However, the non-VR ports of Help Wanted received significantly harsher criticism. Nintendo Life rated the Switch version poorly, with reviewers noting that without VR functionality, the game lost most of what made it special. Playing these scenarios on a traditional screen turned them back into standard FNAF gameplay without the innovation of the VR execution, creating an experience that felt like a step backward rather than forward. This reception emphasized how much of Help Wanted's success was specifically tied to its use of VR technology, rather than just new content. The game's voice acting and sound design deserved particular mention for how they enhanced the VR experience. Tape Girl's increasingly desperate recordings are voice acted with genuine emotion that sells the danger of what she's warning about. The hand unit AI that provides instructions and commentary has a deliberately unsettling corporate cheerfulness that creates dissonance with the horror of what you're experiencing. The ambient sounds of the environment, when you're not actively being threatened, create a constant low-level unease that never lets you fully relax even during safe moments. Help Wanted's influence on the franchise extended beyond its immediate gameplay. It established that FNAF could work in VR, paving the way for Help Wanted 2 and potentially more VR experiences. It introduced Glitchtrap as a major character, who would become important in subsequent game stories. It proved that Scott Cawthon's willingness to let Steel Wool Studios take creative control of development could produce quality results that honored the franchise while bringing new perspectives. And it demonstrated that FNAF's core concepts, the fear of animatronics in the dark, the tension of managing threats while constrained by resources and time, could be effectively translated to new platforms and technologies. The game's meta-narrative about Fazbear Entertainment, trying to cover up their past by framing it as fiction paralleled real-world concerns about how corporations handle their public image and historical crimes, and the suggestion that the VR experience you're playing was designed to gaslight the public about real events, adds a layer of satirical horror to the experience, making you complicit in corporate malfeasance just by participating. This self-awareness about the franchise's own mechanics and narrative became increasingly prominent in later games, with FNAF acknowledging its status as a game series about horror, while finding ways to make that acknowledgement itself horrifying. Help Wanted proved that the evolution of fear in Five Nights at Freddy's wasn't limited to new stories or mechanics, but could come from technological advancement that changed how players experience threats. By bringing the horror into physical space through VR, by making the act of looking around and reaching out into vulnerable commitments, by creating presence where there was once only representation, the game showed that FNAF's fundamental concepts were strong enough to work across dramatically different platforms. The animatronics were frightening on computer monitors, terrifying on VR headsets, and likely would remain so regardless of how technology continues to evolve, because the core of what makes them frightening is deeper than any specific medium of presentation. Environmental dread. Security breaches open world. When Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach released in December 2021, it represented the most radical departure from the franchise's established formula in the series' history. Where every previous mainline entry had confined players to relatively small, enclosed spaces where movement was limited and threats approached along predictable paths, Security Breach opened up into something unprecedented. A massive, fully explorable environment where you could run freely through multiple floors and themed areas of the mega pizzaplex. This shift from static defense to active exploration fundamentally changed the nature of the horror, transforming FNAF from a game about being cornered into a game about being hunted through vast, neon-soaked spaces. The Freddy Fazbear's Mega Pizzaplex is a colossal entertainment complex, something between a mall, an amusement park, and a hotel, filled with attractions, shops, restaurants, and entertainment venues spread across multiple floors. The scale is immediately overwhelming when you first enter as Gregory, a young boy who finds himself trapped in the building after hours. The spaces are huge, are designed to accommodate thousands of visitors during operating hours, and the emptiness during the night makes the vastness feel more threatening than comforting. All this space should mean safety, room to run and hide, but instead it creates an anxious awareness that threats could be anywhere, approaching from any direction, through any of dozens of possible routes. The visual design of the Pizzaplex contributes enormously to its unique atmosphere. Unlike previous FNAF locations with their decayed, claustrophobic, industrial horror aesthetic, the Pizzaplex is bright, colourful, and aggressively modern. Neon signs cast coloured light across polished floors. LED displays advertise attractions with cheerful animations. Everything is designed to look fun and inviting during operating hours, and that overwhelming positivity becomes eerie when the spaces are empty and things that shouldn't move begin stalking through the halls. The disconnect between the environment's purpose as family entertainment and its current state as a hunting ground creates cognitive dissonance that's deeply unsettling. The glam rock animatronics that hunt you through these spaces represent another evolution in the series' character design. Glam rock Chica, Roxanne Wolf, and Montgomery Gator are styled as rock stars, each with their own themed area and personality that's advertised through the Pizzaplex's various displays and decorations. Unlike the horror-focused designs of previous animatronics, these characters were clearly designed to be appealing, merchandise-friendly mascots first, and the fact that they're hunting a child through the building adds a layer of wrongness to their behavior. They call out to Gregory as they search, their voice lines mixing reassurances with threats in ways that highlight how corrupted they've become from their intended purpose. Glamrock Freddy, the titular character, serves as your ally rather than a threat, and this represents another major departure for the series. For the first time, you have protection, something that can physically intervene between you and danger. Freddy allows you to hide inside his chest cavity, which blocks other animatronics from detecting you and provides mobile safety as he walks through areas that would be too dangerous to traverse on foot. This addition of an ally changes the dynamic significantly, and making the game feel less lonely, but also creating new vulnerabilities, as you're dependent on Freddy's battery life and can only summon him in specific locations marked by recharge stations. The gameplay loop of Security Breach is fundamentally different from previous entries. Rather than surviving a set time period through resource management and timing, you're progressing through the Pizzaplex, working toward escape while completing objectives that often require visiting specific locations, gathering items, or solving environmental puzzles. The animatronics patrol these spaces, and while they do follow certain patterns, they're more reactive and unpredictable than the largely scripted threats of earlier games. If they spot you, they give chase, and you must run, hide, or use tools to lose them before they catch you. The save stations scattered throughout the Pizzaplex create an interesting tension around risk management and progress. Unlike previous games where death meant restarting the night, but with knowledge of what to expect, death in Security Breach can mean losing significant progress if you haven't saved recently. This creates difficult decisions about when to push forward toward objectives and when to backtrack to save points, balancing the desire to make progress against the risk of losing time if you're caught. Some objectives require traversing large distances or entering particularly dangerous areas, making the path to the next save point feel like a journey with real stakes. The watch mechanic that provides access to cameras from Gregory's perspective creates an interesting evolution of the series' surveillance mechanics. Rather than sitting in an office watching distant screens, you're viewing cameras while standing in the environment, temporarily vulnerable and unable to move while checking feeds. This mobile surveillance adds strategic depth, allowing you to scout ahead for threats or check if areas you need to traverse are clear, but it requires finding safe positions where you won't be discovered while distracted by the camera view. The encounters with specific animatronics often involve area-specific mechanics or gimmicks that create variety in the threats you face. Chica pursues you through the kitchen and surrounding areas, drawn by sounds and capable of using vents to appear in unexpected locations. Roxy relies on her enhanced visual sensors, but can be temporarily blinded or confused through certain tactics. And Monty shows up in areas associated with his golf-themed attraction, aggressive and capable of breaking through certain barriers other animatronics cannot. These varied threat profiles mean you must adapt your approach depending on which animatronic you're dealing with and where you are in the complex. The daycare section stands out as one of the game's most effective horror sequences, despite, or perhaps because of how it deviates from the rest of Security Breach's gameplay. The daycare attendant, a sun-themed animatronic who maintains the children's play area, enforces one simple rule: keep the lights on. While the lights are on, he's relatively harmless, though unsettlingly enthusiastic and insistent. But if the lights go out, he transforms into Moon, a predatory version that hunts you through the play structures with singular focus. The section forces you to navigate the daycare's ball pits and climbing structures, solving a puzzle to escape while maintaining illumination and evading Moon if you fail. This sequence captures classic FNAF tension of managing a specific task while under threat of immediate danger. However, Security Breach's execution of its ambitious vision was significantly hampered by technical issues at launch. The game released in a state that many critics and players described as unfinished, with numerous bugs, performance problems, crashes, and AI glitches that severely impacted the experience. Animatronics would sometimes get stuck in place, removing the threat they represented. The game would crash unexpectedly, causing loss of progress. Performance issues created stuttering and frame drops that broke immersion and made evasion more difficult. So these technical problems overshadowed the game's conceptual ambitions and led to harsh critical reception. Ben Croshaw of The Escapist gave Security Breach particularly scathing criticism, listing it as the worst game of 2022 and calling it a 6-lane pileup of a game, describing it as too charitable to even call it unfinished. Multiple reviewers noted that the technical performance was so bad it damaged the horror, with enemies getting stuck eliminating any sense of danger and allowing free exploration of areas that should have been threatening. The consensus among critics was that whatever interesting ideas Security Breach contained were buried under a layer of broken execution that made the game more frustrating than frightening. Despite these technical issues, had the game's core concepts represented important evolution for the franchise. The move to open-world exploration showed that FNAF could work in dramatically larger spaces. The addition of an ally animatronic in Freddy demonstrated that the formula could accommodate friendly characters without losing its essential tension. The variety in objectives and the multiple endings based on how you progressed through the game added replayability and narrative branches. The environmental storytelling through the Pizzaplex's design and scattered collectibles showed that the franchise could build worlds, not just survival scenarios. The underlying story of Security Breach, involving a mysterious figure manipulating events from the shadows and the discovery of older, darker secrets buried beneath the Pizzaplex's modern facade, connected the game to the franchise's broader narrative, while also setting up future plot threads. The revelation that the Pizzaplex was built on top of previous Fazbear locations, that the horrors of the past literally underpin the cheerful present, created thematic resonance about how trauma and evil persist beneath surface-level attempts to rebrand and move on. The DLC expansion Ruin, released in July 2023, would refine many of Security Breach's concepts, while also addressing some of its technical shortcomings. But even in its flawed state, the base game represented an important attempt to evolve the franchise into new territory, to prove that FNAF's core concepts could work in a fully 3D, freely explorable environment. The technical execution might have failed, but the ambition and some of the specific implementations, unlike the daycare sequence and the general atmosphere of the empty Pizzaplex, showed promise for what the series could become with more development time and technical refinement. Security Breach's troubled launch became a cautionary tale about the challenges of expanding scope without adequate resources to execute that vision. The game tried to do too much too quickly, jumping from largely static survival horror to an expansive action-adventure hybrid without fully working out all the systems needed to make that transition smooth. But despite its problems, it remained significant for the franchise's evolution, representing the bridge between classic FNAF's confined horror and future entries' potential to create larger, more complex worlds, where the fear comes from the environment itself, as much as from specific threats. Our Refined Terror, Security Breach Ruin, released in July 2023 as a free DLC expansion to Security Breach, FNAF Ruin, represented not just additional content, but a significant refinement of the concepts introduced in the base game, while also correcting many of its predecessors' missteps. Where Security Breach struggled with technical issues and an overwhelming, sometimes unfocused scope, Ruin delivered a more contained, polished experience that understood what worked about the Pizzaplex setting and doubled down on those elements while trimming away much of what didn't. The result was horror that felt more deliberate, more atmospheric, and ultimately more effective than what the base game had achieved. The premise immediately establishes a different tone from Security Breach. You play as Cassie, a girl who receives a desperate message from her friend Gregory, trapped somewhere in the ruins of the now abandoned Pizzaplex. The building has deteriorated significantly in the time since the base game, with structural damage, exposed infrastructure, and a general atmosphere of decay that makes it feel genuinely dangerous. This shift from a functioning entertainment venue to a derelict, half-collapsed structure changes the visual language entirely, bringing back some of the decay aesthetic from earlier FNAF games, while maintaining the unique setting of the Pizzaplex itself. The damaged, malfunctioning versions of the glam rock animatronics create a more traditionally FNAF-style threat than their cleaner base game counterparts. Roxy, in particular, becomes a central antagonist, her damaged state making her more unpredictable and aggressive. The way these characters have deteriorated, both physically and behaviorally, feels like the building itself has infected them with its decay, creating a sense that staying too long in these ruins will corrupt anything exposed to them. This environmental hostility makes the Pizzaplex feel actively malevolent rather than just dangerous. The VANNI mask mechanic represents one of Ruin's most significant innovations, creating a gameplay loop that's unique to this expansion. The mask allows Cassie to see augmented reality elements overlaid on the physical environment, revealing things that aren't visible to the naked eye. Hidden pathways, collectibles, and most importantly, digital hazards and entities that exist in the AR layer. This creates a fascinating tension where you must frequently switch between normal and AR vision, each mode revealing different threats and opportunities. What appears safe in normal vision might be filled with AR hazards, and vice versa, forcing constant mode switching and creating vulnerability through the act of transitioning. The AR elements add a horror layer that's distinct from the physical threats of the animatronics. AR objects can block paths or create barriers that must be disabled through environmental puzzles. AR entities can appear without warning, requiring you to quickly remove the mask to avoid them. This blending of digital and physical horror creates a unique kind of paranoia, where reality itself becomes unreliable, where you cannot trust that what you're seeing represents all the threats present in your environment. The mask becomes both a tool and a vulnerability, essential for progress but dangerous to use for extended periods. The MXES entity, a digital rabbit-like figure that appears in AR space and attempts to stop Cassie's progress, creates a cat-and-mouse dynamic that's different from the animatronic threats. It doesn't exist in physical space, but can still harm you within the AR layer, creating encounters that are tense precisely because they're not bound by physical rules. Defeating or evading MXES involves puzzles and quick thinking, rather than just running and hiding, adding gameplay variety that breaks up the exploration and evasion gameplay of traversing the ruined Pizzaplex. The integration of the Mimic, a key antagonist from the recent lore, and brings the DLC's story into contact with the franchise's larger narrative in meaningful ways. Without spoiling specific reveals, the Mimic's ability to replicate voices and manipulate through deception creates a horror of uncertainty. where you cannot be sure whether the guidance you're receiving is genuine or malicious. This paranoia about your objectives, about whether you're being rescued or led into a trap, adds psychological weight to the physical dangers of the environment and enemies. The environmental design in Ruin is significantly more atmospheric than Security Breach's base game. The collapsed sections, exposed machinery, flickering lights, and accumulated debris create a sense of genuine danger from the structure itself. You're not just worried about animatronics. You're worried about whether the floor will support your weight, whether exposed wires are live, whether structural elements might collapse. This environmental hostility makes even safe moments feel tense because the building itself can't be trusted not to harm you. The sound design is particularly effective at creating unease through ambient audio. The structure groans and creaks constantly, making every sound potentially significant. Distant crashes suggest instability elsewhere in the building. The damaged animatronics make different sounds than their functional counterparts. Mechanical failing mixed with distorted voice lines creating an audio signature that's disturbing in its wrongness. When you're moving through dark, debris-filled spaces, relying heavily on audio cues to detect threats, and this rich soundscape becomes crucial for survival while also being constantly nerve-wracking. The game's pacing is more controlled than Security Breach's often chaotic progression. Ruin guides you through the ruins in a more linear fashion, reducing the overwhelming openness that sometimes made the base game feel directionless. This more focused approach means objectives are clearer, progress is more satisfying, and the horror beats are better spaced and more impactful. You're not wandering vast, empty spaces wondering what you're supposed to do. You're following a path through dangers, and that path's clarity makes the threats along it feel more deliberate and frightening. The technical performance of Ruin represented a significant improvement over Security Breach's launch state. While not perfect, the DLC was notably more stable, with fewer crashes, better AI behavior, and improved performance overall. This technical polish allowed the horror to land more effectively, as players weren't distracted by glitches or frustrated by broken systems. The animatronics behaved as intended, creating genuine tension, rather than accidentally becoming non-threats through bugs. The endings, and particularly the ambiguity around certain reveals and character fates, created extensive community discussion and theory crafting. The elevator scene near the conclusion has been analyzed extensively for its implications about who survives, who's being manipulated, and what the ending really means for the characters and the larger narrative. This ambiguity felt appropriate for FNAF, and maintaining the series' tradition of not providing completely clear answers while giving enough information to fuel passionate debate. Ruin's compact scope, approximately 4 to 6 hours for a complete playthrough, compared to Security Breach's much longer but more diluted experience, worked in its favor. The DLC felt dense with content and tension, never overstaying its welcome or padding its runtime with empty space. This suggested that for the Pizzaplex setting, a more focused approach might be more effective than the sprawling scale Security Breach attempted. That horror benefits from curation and pacing over sheer size. The character work, particularly with Roxy, whose damaged state and interactions with Cassie created surprisingly emotional moments and showed that FNAF could incorporate character development and pathos without losing its horror edge. The way Roxy's arc developed added depth to a character who had been relatively one-dimensional in the base game, suggesting that the animatronics could be more than just threats when given appropriate narrative space. Ruin's success demonstrated that Steel Wool Studios had learned from Security Breach's reception and was capable of refining their approach based on feedback and experience. The DLC took the core concepts that worked, polished the execution, and discarded or minimized elements that had proven problematic. This iterative improvement suggested that future entries in the franchise, particularly those continuing to explore larger 3D environments, and would benefit from these lessons and potentially deliver experiences that combined ambition with execution more successfully than Security Breach managed. The evolution of core mechanics. Across more than a decade of games, Five Nights at Freddy's has continuously evolved its core mechanics while maintaining the fundamental elements that define the franchise's approach to horror. Understanding how these mechanics have changed reveals not just the series development, but also how the creators have refined their understanding of what makes players afraid and how to maintain that fear across increasingly familiar scenarios. The surveillance camera mechanic, present in almost every entry, has transformed significantly from its origins. In the first game, cameras were your only tool for tracking animatronic positions, creating a fundamental tension between gaining information and the power cost of monitoring. The tablet interface, which obscured your view of the office while raised, meant that checking cameras always involved risk. By FNAF 2, cameras had evolved to include the music box winding function, transforming them from pure information tools into essential maintenance systems you couldn't afford to neglect. FNAF 3 weaponized cameras by allowing audio lures, making them active tools for manipulating threats rather than passive observation. Sister Location largely abandoned cameras in favor of direct interaction with threats, but Help Wanted brought them back in VR format, where the physical act of holding and looking at a tablet created new vulnerabilities. Security Breach transformed cameras into a mobile tool accessed through Gregory's watch. Like surveillance, you could perform anywhere, but that left you vulnerable while accessing. This evolution from office-bound monitoring to mobile scouting represents the series' broader shift from static to dynamic gameplay. Door mechanics have similarly evolved in sophistication. The original game's simple door closing system created the most elegant version of this mechanic. Perfect protection at unsustainable cost. FNAF2's removal of doors forced new defensive strategies, showing that the series didn't need this core mechanic to function. FNAF3 brought back door-like mechanics through ventilation sealing, creating similar trade-offs without literal doors. FNAF4 eliminated doors entirely in favor of closet and bed checking, proving the franchise could create compelling horror without its most iconic defensive tool. Our later games largely moved away from door mechanics as the shift to exploration-based gameplay made static barriers less relevant, but the underlying principle, the need to create barriers between yourself and threats at a cost, persisted in new forms. This showed that mechanics could evolve in surface implementation while maintaining their essential purpose. Resource management has been perhaps the most consistently present mechanic across the series. The original game's power management created immediate, escalating pressure that defined moment-to-moment decision-making. FNAF2 replaced this with flashlight batteries that recharged but depleted quickly, shifting from managing scarce resources over time to managing regenerating resources moment to moment. FNAF3 added system maintenance by creating multiple resources that needed attention and management. FNAF4 eliminated traditional resource management entirely, replacing it with time management as you had to check multiple locations on cycles while listening for audio cues. Sister Location varied wildly in how it handled resources from night to night, showing less interest in this core mechanic than previous entries. Security Breach introduced stamina for running and Freddy's battery life, resources that limited your defensive options but regenerated with appropriate strategies. This evolution from strict resource limitation to more forgiving but still constraining systems reflected the series' shift from punishing survival horror to more accessible horror action. The core purpose remained, forcing players to make difficult choices about defensive actions based on limited capacity. But the implementation became less focused on perfect resource optimization and more on strategic decision-making within looser constraints. Audio design has remained critically important throughout the series' evolution, while changing in implementation. The original game used audio cues to provide information about threats that weren't visible on cameras. Footsteps indicated movement, specific sounds suggested specific animatronics, kitchen audio revealed Chica's location. These cues were essential for efficient play but not always obvious, rewarding attention while punishing inattention. FNAF 4 made audio the primary mechanic, requiring players to distinguish breathing patterns from ambient sounds with perfect accuracy or face immediate death. This was audio design at its most unforgiving and most central to gameplay. Help Wanted's VR audio created three-dimensional soundscapes where you could locate threats by direction and distance, leveraging spatial audio technology that wasn't available in earlier flat-screen games. Security Breach used audio cues to indicate animatronic proximity and alertness states, maintaining the series' tradition of making sound-essential information while adapting to free-roam gameplay. Jump scares, the series' signature fear delivery mechanism, have evolved in their implementation and role. Early games used jump scares as punishment for failure, the consequence of depleting power or failing to defend properly. They were brief, loud, and served to shock after minutes of sustained tension. Later games began experimenting with jump scares that didn't end the game, like FNAF 3's phantom animatronics that scared you and disrupted systems, but didn't kill you immediately. VR jump scares in Help Wanted became far more intense simply through the technology's immersive nature, faces lunging at you in three-dimensional space rather than filling a flat screen. Security Breach's jump scares often involved being grabbed during chase sequences, making them more dynamic and contextual rather than static screen fills. This evolution showed awareness that jump scares lose effectiveness through repetition and must be implemented with variation to maintain impact. The relationship between player and animatronics has fundamentally shifted over the series' evolution. Early games positioned you as purely defensive, with no way to affect or combat the threats beyond delaying them. Later games introduced more active mechanics, audio lures to redirect Springtrap, flashlights that could repel certain animatronics, stunning tools, and eventually Freddy as a mobile safe zone in Security Breach. This shift from pure defense to active interaction changed the power dynamic between player and threat. You're still outmatched, still vulnerable, but you have agency beyond just hiding and hoping. This evolution reflects broader trends in horror gaming toward giving players tools to fight back, while maintaining the essential imbalance that makes survival feel earned rather than expected. The narrative integration of mechanics has grown more sophisticated across the series. Early games had simple lore delivered through phone calls, with mechanics largely divorced from story beyond the basic premise. Later entries, like Sister Location, created story-driven scenarios where each night's mechanics directly served narrative purposes, making you experience specific events rather than just surviving generic nights. Pizzeria Simulator integrated mechanics with narrative by making the business simulation serve the story purpose of building a trap. Every decision you made contributing to the final convergence. This approach of mechanics serving narrative rather than narrative just explaining mechanics represented maturation in how the series understood the relationship between play and story. Looking across all these mechanical evolutions, several patterns emerge. First, the series has consistently been willing to discard or radically alter core mechanics rather than treating them as sacred. Cameras, doors, power management, all have been present, absent or transformed across different games based on what that particular entry's horror concept needed. Second, there's been a general trend toward giving players more agency and tools while maintaining fundamental vulnerability. You're less helpless in Security Breach than in FNAF 1, but you're still definitely not safe, and that tension between capability and danger has been carefully maintained across the increasing player empowerment. Third, the series has moved from purely mechanical horror to more narrative horror without abandoning its mechanical roots. The stories have become more important, more complex, but they still serve gameplay rather than overwhelming it. The balance between mechanics that create fear and narrative that contextualizes it has been refined across iterations. Finally, technological advancement has consistently enabled new approaches to fear. The shift from simple graphics to more sophisticated modeling, from flat screens to VR, from static environments to free roam spaces. Each technological step has been leveraged to create new types of horror while maintaining the franchise's essential identity. FNAF has evolved with technology without being defined by it, using new capabilities to enhance fear rather than simply existing to showcase technical advancement. Conclusion and reflection. As we emerge from this exploration of how fear has evolved across more than a decade of Five Nights at Freddy's games, certain truths become clear about what this franchise has accomplished and why it has endured, where so many other horror games have faded from relevance. Five Nights at Freddy's succeeded not through any single innovation, but through continuous evolution, a willingness to experiment with form and mechanics and setting, while maintaining the core of what makes its particular brand of horror effective. The journey from that first cramped office to the sprawling ruins of the Pizzaplex represents more than technological advancement or increased scope. It represents a deepening understanding of fear itself, of how different people are frightened by different things, and how horror can be approached from countless angles while still maintaining coherence and identity. Some players find the original game's simplicity the most effective, the pure concentration of anticipation and consequence creating terror through elegant restraint. Others respond more strongly to FNAF 4's personal psychological horror, to the vulnerability of childhood and the intimacy of threats invading domestic spaces. Still others find the immersive presence of Help Wanted's VR or the environmental dread of Security Breach's massive spaces most effective at getting under their skin. This variety of approaches across the series means that FNAF has something for almost everyone who enjoys horror gaming. Multiple entries that create fear in fundamentally different ways, while sharing enough DNA to feel like part of a cohesive whole. The franchise has become a spectrum of horror experiences rather than a single approach repeated across iterations, and that breadth has allowed it to remain relevant and engaging through multiple technological generations and shifting gaming trends. What's particularly remarkable is how the series has managed to maintain fear across familiarity. By the time you're playing your 10th FNAF game, you understand the basic language of how these games work. Animatronics are threats. You need to manage resources and attention. Getting caught means jump scares and failure. The fundamental elements are no longer surprising, yet the games continue to be frightening because they've evolved past relying solely on surprise or novelty, instead building horror through execution, atmosphere, and the psychological pressure of having to perform under duress. The evolution of the franchise also reflects broader shifts in independent horror gaming and how indie developers can compete with major studios. The original FNAF was made by one person with limited tools, proving that effective horror doesn't require massive budgets or cutting-edge technology. Later entries involved larger teams and more sophisticated development, but maintained the indie spirit of experimentation and willingness to take risks that major studios might avoid. The franchise has served as a bridge between true indie development and larger production values, showing how successful games can scale while maintaining their essential character. Scott Cawthon's willingness to hand off development to Steelwool Studios while remaining involved in narrative and creative direction has allowed the series to evolve in ways that might not have been possible if he'd insisted on making every entry himself. This collaborative approach, trusting other developers to bring fresh perspectives while maintaining oversight to preserve the franchise's identity, has enabled the technological and mechanical experiments of later entries while keeping them recognizably FNAF. The series' approach to storytelling through gameplay rather than cutscenes has influenced how horror games think about narrative delivery. By hiding story in minigames, environmental details, and implications rather than explicitly spelling everything out, FNAF created a mystery that engaged the community in active interpretation rather than passive consumption. This approach has been widely imitated but rarely executed as effectively, as it requires careful balance between too much obscurity and too much clarity. Looking forward, the evolution of fear in Five Nights at Freddy's suggests the franchise still has room for continued experimentation. The move to VR showed that new technologies can meaningfully enhance rather than just repackage the horror. The open-world approach of Security Breach, despite its technical struggles, demonstrated that FNAF concepts can work in larger, less constrained environments. Future entries will likely continue pushing boundaries, testing what does and doesn't work, refining what succeeds and discarding what fails. The franchise has also become a cultural phenomenon, extending far beyond the games themselves, with books, films, merchandise, and a massive community of creators making art, theories, and derivative works. This cultural footprint means that FNAF's influence on the horror gaming is broader than just its direct mechanical or aesthetic contributions. It's shaped how horror game communities form, how fans engage with ambiguous narratives, and how indie developers think about marketing and community interaction. What makes Five Nights at Freddy's special in the landscape of horror gaming is not any single element, but the combination of accessibility, depth, mystery, and willingness to evolve. The games are approachable for players new to horror, while offering enough challenge and hidden complexity to engage veteran players, and the stories invite interpretation without requiring a mastery of complex lore to enjoy the basic experience. And the franchise has consistently surprised its audience by refusing to become predictable. By taking risks with mechanics and format that could have easily failed, but often succeeded at creating new kinds of fear. As we drift toward the end of this exploration, consider what has frightened you most across this franchise's evolution. Was it the pure tension of the original game's resource management? The overwhelming pressure of FNAF 2's layered threats? The isolation of FNAF 3? The intimate vulnerability of FNAF 4? The body horror of Sister Location? The narrative weight of Pizzeria Simulator? The immersive presence of Help Wanted? The environmental dread of Security Breach? Each represents a different facet of fear, a different way that horror can manifest and affect us. And together, they demonstrate how much variety can exist within what seems like a simple premise of surviving against animatronic threats. Five Nights at Freddy's has evolved from a simple indie game to a franchise that has fundamentally shaped modern horror gaming. Not by inventing entirely new concepts, but by executing familiar ones with exceptional understanding of what makes people afraid and how to sustain that fear across time and familiarity. It's shown that evolution doesn't require abandoning your identity, that experimentation and consistency can coexist, and that sometimes the most effective horror comes not from trying to do something unprecedented, but from doing something familiar with enough craft and care to make it feel new again. If you've enjoyed this exploration of how fear has evolved across the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise, please like and subscribe for more deep dives into gaming horror and lore. Let me know in the comments which game in the series affected you most powerfully and why. Understanding what makes different people respond to different flavors of fear is endlessly fascinating, and the variety of answers will likely demonstrate how successfully FNAF has created a spectrum of horror experiences, rather than a single note repeated across years. Until next time, may your nights be peaceful and your doors remain closed when they need to be. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the evolution of fear in Five Nights at Freddy's.